a second time, and I call the honourable member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I say up front that Labor will be supporting this bill in the Parliament, but nevertheless I move that all the words after that be omitted with a view to substituting the following words. Whilst not declining to give the bill a second reading, the House notes that the government's mismanagement and politicisation of Australian Research Council grants and failure to adequately support Australia's universities during the pandemic are causing serious harm to our world-class researchers. And I thank the member for Kingsford Smith for seconding that. Deputy Speaker, the bill amends the Australian Research Council Act, applying indexation to our research programs while also inserting funding for the 2024-25 financial year. It's routine legislation and it needs to pass this House to guarantee funding under rolling forward estimates. The Australian Research Council is an independent Commonwealth body and is the centrepiece of higher education research in this country. It funds primary research, it funds applied research, and this legislation is essential to support its ongoing operations. The Labor Party supports the Council's important work, which is why we support this bill. Yeah. But while we're happy to support this particular measure, we're not happy with how the Morrison government has treated the ARC over many years now, and the Abbott-Turnbull escapades before this, current manifestation of incompetence and venom. It's a national scandal, Deputy Speaker, and it's getting worse and worse. In recent years, we've seen consistent delays to grant decisions, delays which seem to be getting longer every year. We've seen political interference from ministers, culture war manoeuvres where they're trumping the ARC's independence. We've seen disrespect from the highest levels of government, and it's unfair to all the brilliant, hard-working, nation-building professionals in our university system. And it's a terrible, short-sighted attack on this country's economic future. Smart countries know the value of research. They know that it drives economic growth, that it encourages innovation, that it expands our sense of history and human capacity and who we are. But that's clearly not how the Morrison government views research. Last year, the Morrison government delayed the announcement of research grants until Christmas Eve. Literally the night before Christmas, like Ebenezer Scrooge in the Dickens novel. You can imagine the uncertainty this caused our poor researchers, who didn't know if they still had their jobs in the next year or if their projects would be able to continue. How can you plan your career or commit to long-term research projects when you don't know things until the last minute? Well, you can't. What about rent, food, mortgages, families? All put in limbo due to coalition incompetence. Our Shadow Education Minister, the member for Sydney, Tanya Plibersek, wrote to the Australian National Audit Office requesting an audit into this Morrison government's administration of ARC grants. She sent that letter because of her belief that this was a serious failure of public administration. Now, unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, the Audit Office denied the request. That was disappointing, but our concerns with the ARC are still there. On Christmas Eve, the acting minister vetoed 6 of the recommended projects because they didn't suit the Morrison government agenda or their tastes. This was particularly cruel. An enormous amount of work goes into these applications. Months and months of planning and editing and writing, and they were denied at the flick of a pen by an acting minister. As Professor Brian Schmidt, the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, said at the time, and I quote, "In a liberal democracy, you make the grant rules. The independent research agency uses peer review to determine funding. It is completely inappropriate for grants to be removed by politicians unless the grant rules were not followed." Now, Professor Schmidt is a Nobel Prize winner in astrophysics, so Brian knows a thing or two about research. Professor Schmidt knows just how damaging these arbitrary decisions can be. And this wasn't a first for this government. In 2018, the Minister for Education, Senator Birmingham, personally vetoed $4.2 million worth of grants from the Australian Research Council. Researchers described the minister's behaviour as reprehensible, saying that it undermined the impartiality of the entire grants process. This kind of political interference does serious harm to Australia's world-class university research sector. It damages our international reputation, and it makes it harder for universities to retain and recruit top-notch staff, putting thousands of jobs at risk. The role of a Minister for Education should be to ensure that the ARC's grant processes are rigorous, fair and transparent, and then hands off. Obviously, they need to make sure that the council is competent and well run. Then they should leave the independent agency to function without unnecessary and cumbersome political interference. Now, we hear a lot about free speech from the Morrison government, particularly some of the members patrolling out the front of the parliament, in fact. But when it really comes down to it, when they have a chance to walk the walk, hypocritically, they did the complete opposite. They clamped down on speech that they disagreed with. Now, that's not Labor's approach. We support freedom of speech, not as a slogan or as a culture war, but as a fundamental principle of a free society. And if Labor wins the next election, we're committed to approving grant applications that are recommended by a rigorous ARC peer review process. And they'll be delivered on time, on a pre-established date, not Christmas Eve, I can guarantee you of that, and it'll be well in advance of the grant's commencement. That's the Labor guarantee. Because we've got to do much, much more to support our universities, particularly after the past 2 horrific years. 2 of the hardest years in the history of higher education. We know that the Prime Minister abandoned higher education during the pandemic. In its hour of need, he deliberately and systematically deserted them. As thousands of university staff members were losing their jobs, the Prime Minister, what did he do? Well, he excluded universities from JobKeeper. Businesses with booming profits, well, they got JobKeeper. 39 billion, in fact. 39 billion went to profitable companies. But universities were coldly left out, a cruel and calculated decision by the Prime Minister. Now, look, Deputy Speaker, I don't know what happened to the member for Cook when he was at university, but slaking his revenge has turned out to be a disaster for the sector. Across the pandemic, 40,000 jobs were cut across tertiary education. That's an unbelievable figure, 40,000 jobs. It's a hard number to get your head around. What does 40,000 jobs mean? Well, that's 40,000 homes hit, 40,000 families rattled. Thousands of these jobs were in regional Australia. So that's why we've heard so many National Party MPs speaking up about this. Just kidding, Deputy Speaker, that did not happen. Thousands of jobs in those bush areas, places like Rockhampton, Bathurst, Armidale, Geelong, Warrnambool, Toowoomba, Townsville, and I could go on. Because, Deputy Speaker, universities are Australia's 4th biggest export industry, and they've been hung out to dry by the Morrison government. Higher education is not a burden, it's an investment that delivers returns, and so is research. Unfortunately, because of the Morrison government's abandonment during the pandemic, an estimated 7,000 research jobs were lost in the past 2 years. Departments have been shut down. Research institutes like the National Centre for Flood Research in Lismore have closed. Under the Liberal Party, Australia has been a difficult place for researchers. A 2016 survey of medical researchers found that 83% of them had contemplated leaving the profession. Now, that is a fair dinkum brain drain flowing from the pen of the Education Minister, the Prime Minister's office. The Australian Postdoctoral Reference Survey found that over half of our early career researchers had thought about moving overseas, and plenty of them have already made this choice, an exodus of talent from our shores, where other countries will receive the benefits of that investment. These are the kinds of people who helped supercharge our vaccine development, the people who liberated us from the worst of COVID and the pandemic. And we're watching them walk out the door. The truth is you can't have a strong, modern economy without a healthy research system. It's something we desperately need in this country. According to research by Harvard University, Australia has the economic complexity of a developing nation. Australia was between Uganda and Burkina Faso as the 87th most complex economy in the world. 87th. This isn't just an economic risk, it's holding our economy back. As a country, we spend well below the OECD average on research and development. New technology and breakthroughs don't emerge out of thin air. We need researchers to discover them. We need a system that encourages their work. The Liberal Party has never given researchers the support they need. You need a Labor government to do that. We need a Labor government that will invest in our universities again, that will deliver up to 20,000 new university places that will help fill skill shortages and fill future skills needs by training Australians in jobs including engineering, nursing, tech and teaching, to name but a few. Places that will prioritise for universities offering more opportunities for underrepresented groups, such as people in regional parts. I hope the National Party hears that. People from regional parts of Australia will retrieve that helping hand. So their best and brightest kids from the bush get to go to our universities. Also remote and outer suburban areas, those who are in the first in their family to study at university, and obviously First Nations people, First Nation Australians. A Labor government that will use its $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund to help translate brilliant discoveries and inventions into new Australian businesses and new Australian jobs. That will put real resources into research and development. Labor governments have always invested in higher education. Obviously, Gough Whitlam made my university study possible, but we've got a long history of investing in higher education. We've always opened them up to more students from less privileged backgrounds so their best and brightest can solve the problems of a modern Australia. We've always supported research. That's our legacy and that's our ambition. Our universities won't be rebuilt under the Liberals who spent their term in office trashing them. What a legacy. We need a Labor government to rebuild our universities.
Well done.
Matt.